And thank you all for joining this session in which we try to reflect on work that is related to climate change. And I am going to share some thoughts with you based on a project called Inclusive Low Emission Development, ILED, in East African dairy. And it's linked up with a couple of partners working in Tanzania and Kenya. And I use this opportunity to see how far we can go with what may be called paradoxical thinking. So this project set out from the realization that if we look at dairy production, but also trade and consumption, it's very diverse. And there's an enormous biophysical variability. On the other hand, dairy is an important part on the policy agenda for low emission development related to the greenhouse gas emissions. And following from that is a kind of policy bias towards intensification and commercialization. So that has a very specific intervention logic. And that's not easy to reconcile. So what we try to do in our thinking is, well, maybe I discovered a couple of paradoxes. One of them is the paradox between adaptation and mitigation. So the kind of dominant intervention logic is more mitigation oriented. It wants to really avoid any emission of low greenhouse gases. But that runs the risk and that you bypass the enormous variety of adaptation practices. So where institutes like ILRI are working on trying to move towards intensification, may neglect all the adaptation practices that you see on the ground, and may even push farmers in a direction that is kind of not fitting the logic in which they operate. So one of the possible ways of reconciling this paradox or handling it, making it productive, has to do with contextual design. So try to be careful with thinking along very generic recipes, but see what's the kind of space that you can create for contextual design. Another paradox that I discovered in thinking about the work that we do is the paradox between resilience and transformation. So if I listen to the speech of Bruce, he emphasizes transformation, transform the system. On the other hand, if you look at how people cope with climate change, it's already something that they can be resilient. And also that's a paradox. It's not necessarily leading to attention, but maybe they can be brought together. One of the things that we do in the project is also to then support what I labeled territorial governance. So not only focusing on influencing, let's say, the national agendas like the NDCs, but also see how at lower governance levels, you can find ways in which resilience and transformation are brought together. And that can, for example, be done in, we worked with local governments, wherein it was already something to bring together the dairy-focused departments with the environmental departments. And both were working on adaptation, and they found ways to liaise with the more transformative aspects induced by policy. And the final paradox that I could think of was the paradox between what I call diversity and closure. If you think about scaling, and there's literature from the kind of organization sciences on that, it says a condition for scaling is that there's closure. There's a limitation of the choices still available. And that may contrast with local diversity, with local capacities to handle climate change. And then I thought, oh, what does it mean then for your thinking about adoption? And one of the literatures that I like talks about affordances and the conditions for unpacking them. So that means that in terms of intervention, you try to see what is it that intensification practices or commercialization practice offer, but you emphasize that there should be conditions for unpacking those affordances, rather than being concerned with only uptaking the solution that you already fixed in the laboratory. And this is work, for example, by Dominic Glover at the Institute of Development Studies that tries to refine our thinking about adoption. So these were my 5 minutes for reflecting on paradoxes in the project that I work with.